that to a large extent this situation has been accumulating. And in the decisive context that was happening as a result of the actions of the US and their other Western colleagues, of NATO extension and unipolar world taking hold. As for our geopolitical space, it was done in the interests of restraining Russia, containing Russia, and to that end, for many years, Ukraine was used consistently as a springboard, as a foothold in order to irritate and contain our country. Ukrainian government activity was encouraged in their activity, that all those actions that prohibited everything Russian information, Russian culture, Russian language, and in parallel with that, it was enshrined in legislative framework, all those steps that promote the Nazi theory and the Nazi practices. Quite naturally, the UN Secretary General knows full well of those decisions that were declared by President Putin about the reasons and the targets and the goals of the operation that is conducted by our military with the Donetsk and Luhansk militia on the territory of the Ukraine. These goals are, first and foremost, to protect the civilian population. And here we have an interest of working together with our UN colleagues, together with colleagues from the International Red Cross Committee, as for additional efforts to alleviate the suffering and the situation for the civilian population. The UN, after the contacts between the UN Secretary General with our Ministry of Defense, which happened almost 2 months ago, we have agreed and we have created a working group that is based here in Moscow at our Ministry of Defense. UN representatives agree on specific things, negotiate specific things that allow to safely deliver humanitarian aid through the UN, through Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, managed to launch 5 such humanitarian convoys. They were dispatched to different regions of the Ukraine, in addition to the humanitarian aid that is daily being given now to Ukrainian citizens and Donetsk and Luhansk as well, naturally, through Russian military, Russian Ministry of Defense and Emergency Ministry and other NGOs of Russia. Today we have discussed possible actions, how to strengthen our cooperation on this track, and I think that as the outcome of negotiations in Moscow, we'll be able to define what kind of steps we can take, whether they will be relevant in the current situation. Naturally, we talked about the future of the UN in general, about those attempts of our Western colleagues, first and foremost, to place the discussion of crucial matters outside of universal formats, outside of the UN and its system, creating rubber-stamping different partnerships and institutions, and issuing calls who have been presented as the forefront of humanity, as the select few. And the same way goes for the alliance of multilateralists promoted by Germany and France. Is it not in competition with the UN? As well as the US initiative, who last year held a summit for democracy. They issued invitations on their own without consulting anyone. And we have called the attention of our partners today during the negotiations. This is an alarm bell for the UN. This is an attempt to cross out the basic rules of the UN Charter, the basic principles of the UN Charter. And that is that the organization was created on the basis of sovereign equality of states. This is enshrined in the UN Charter, and we have to remind about that. We'll do that more often, so that no one, neither in New York, nor in other member countries would forget about that. And in the end, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to the UN Secretary General, who has initiated such contact. We have readily responded, and that highlights the great significance that we attach to regular dialogue and comparing notes with the leadership of the UN Secretariat. I think that through all difficulties that continue to multiply in global affairs, such a frank and honest discussion is very, very useful, so that in the end we could go back to the sources, to the UN Charter, and on the basis of this Charter we could build any kind of mechanism how to develop multilateralism. Multilateralism today is one of the key terms. Once again, I'd like to thank Secretary General for giving this framework for today's conversation. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen of the press, as Secretary General of the United Nations, I came to Moscow as a messenger of peace. My objective and my agenda is strictly linked to save lives and to reduce suffering. I had a very frank discussion with the Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, and it is clear that there are two different positions on what is happening in Ukraine. According to the Russian Federation, what is taking place is a special military operation with the objectives that were announced. According to the UN, in line with the resolutions passed by the General Assembly, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a violation of its territorial integrity and against the Charter of the United Nations. But it is my deep conviction that the sooner we end this war, the better, for the people of Ukraine, for the people of the Russian Federation, and those far beyond. The United Nations has repeatedly called for ceasefires to protect civilians and to facilitate a political dialogue to reach a solution. So far, that has not been possible. Today, across the Donbass, a violent battle is underway with tremendous death and destruction. Many civilians are being killed, and hundreds of thousands of people are in life-threatening conditions trapped by the conflict. I am concerned about the repeated reports of violations of international humanitarian and human rights law and possible war crimes, and they require independent investigation for effective accountability. And we urgently need humanitarian corridors that are truly safe and effective and that are respected by all to evacuate civilians and deliver much-needed assistance. To that end, I have proposed the establishment of a humanitarian contact group bringing together the Russian Federation, Ukraine and the United Nations to look for opportunities for the opening of safe corridors with local cessation of hostilities and to guarantee that they are actually effective. Simultaneously, we recognize that we face a crisis within a crisis in Mariupol. Thousands of civilians are in dire need of life-saving humanitarian assistance and many of evacuation. The United Nations is ready to fully mobilize its human and logistical resources to help save lives in Mariupol. My proposal is for a coordinated work of the United Nations, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and Ukraine and Russian Federation forces to enable the safe evacuation of those civilians who want to leave, both inside the Azovstal plan and in the city, in any direction they choose, and to deliver the humanitarian aid required. And this is not just about what is happening in Ukraine, as we are seeing shockwaves around the world. The dramatic acceleration of the increase of the prices for food and energy that was already taking place in the last year are causing enormous suffering to hundreds of millions of the most vulnerable people worldwide. And this comes on top of the shock of the continued COVID-19 pandemic and the uneven access to resources for recovery that particularly penalize developing countries around the world. And so the sooner peace is established, the better for the sake of Ukraine, Russia, and for the world. And it's very important, even in these moments of difficulty, to keep alive the values of multilateralism. We need a world that is multipolar, with multilateral institutions, and those multilateral institutions must abide by the UN Charter and by international law. And abiding by the UN Charter and by international law, recognizing full equality among states, they hopefully will be an instrument that will allow us once again to come together as humankind and address the dramatic challenges we face, from climate change to epidemics and to many others, and in which the only war we should have would be a war of those that put the planet at risk.
Уважаемые коллеги, переходим к вопросам. Пожалуйста, India Today.
Moving on to questions, please, India Today.
I am Geeta Mohan from India Today. I have a question each from both the leadership, beginning with the United Nations Secretary General, sir. Mr. Guterres, sir, there are allegations and counter-allegations regarding genocide, war crimes, human shields, as also reports of chemical weapons and biological weapons being used. You spoke about contact group and humanitarian corridors. You also spoke about investigations. Will the United Nations look at independent investigations, creating a team, an investigating team, to look into the facts on the ground? And my question to the Foreign Minister, sir, both sides, whether it's the United Nations or the international community, are looking at negotiated settlement and ceasefire. Should Russia look at a negotiated settlement? Is there a country or an organization that could act as a mediator? Who would Russia consider as a mediating agency? Thank you.
Well, the UN Secretariat has not the power to do investigations of that kind. We have the International Criminal Court, we have the different mechanisms that exist in the human rights system, namely commissions of inquiry. It is not my intention to promote an investigation myself. I have not the authority for it, but I think it's very important to have independent investigations in order to have full credibility and full accountability.
Now, as for the question addressed to me, first I wanted to say about the positions that the international community is taking and what the UN should think about these positions. Naturally, simultaneously with the inviolable principles of the UN, for example, sovereign equality of states, as I said. Mr. Secretary General referenced a General Assembly resolution that condemned Russia and the situation, what's happening in the Ukraine. It was deemed intrusion, invasion, and a violation of territorial integrity. This was a resolution that was voted on. It was not a consensus resolution. Many countries complained that they were forced to vote like that, and the U.S. were capturing ambassadors and pushing them to do that, threatening to use their children going to universities or accounts in the American banks. I'm not exaggerating here. Still, this resolution was not voted unanimously on. Several dozen countries refused to support it. Naturally, every General Assembly resolution is a mandate for the Secretariat, and the Secretariat is explaining its approach here. However, the Security Council resolutions should also be sacred for the Secretariat, especially consensus resolution, when all 15 members vote for a specific solution. And it was through consensus that in February 2015, that the document was endorsed. It was called the Minsk Package of Measures. This paper clearly states that there is a need for a direct dialogue between Kiev, Donetsk, and Luhansk in order to settle all issues back then within the territorial integrity of the Ukraine. The only thing that was necessary is to fulfill the obligations that first President Poroshenko signed under, then President Zelensky, and to give a special status to self-declared Donetsk and Luhansk republics, to ensure amnesty, to ensure, in agreement with the republics, the constitution of the Ukraine, considering the decentralization, but maintaining the territorial integrity of the Ukraine, and later also in agreement with Donetsk and Luhansk to arrange elections. I do not remember that the UN Secretariat referenced somehow this direct and blatant sabotage by Kiev of this Minsk agreement. And it was a consensus UN Security Council resolution, which is part of international law, the UN Security Council resolutions. We spoke about that today, and quite frankly, we've known each other for a long time. We have good, friendly relations, and I think such a conversation is impossible to be postponed forever. At this point in time, we're at the stage of international relations when the moment of truth comes. Either we all agree that one entity with its satellites decides how the humanity will live in the future, or the humanity will be living by the UN Charter. It's a very simple choice. No one wants to have any war, God forbid. However, presenting the arguments and demanding response from those who violate the UN Charter that's a must. And I'm telling you that more and more countries with their history, civilization, and culture, with great legacy, want to hold this position, because this conversation cannot be avoided. And I hope that the UN, this institution rooted in the UN Charter, the greatest document of all times, will be a catalyst in the development of this frank and honest dialogue without ultimatums, without threats, and without attempts to solve issues by force, including by the force of financial and economic power, what else our Western colleagues have, and that they abuse their position in the global system. And I think this is a very blatant abuse. As for negotiation solutions, naturally we would like to have a negotiation solution. If you remember, at the beginning of March, right when President Zelensky offered to have negotiations, we have agreed. But the way the Ukrainian delegation behaved at the negotiations, and later the President Zelensky himself refusing to acknowledge what they confirmed a week before, and they received new proposals, well, this is very disheartening. It seems that they're not very interested in negotiations, and they think that, as they were promised by those who call not to let Russia win, and those to call to defeat and destroy Russia, that those will continue to pump Ukraine full of weapons, in tremendous amounts of weapons. If that will continue, naturally, negotiations are hardly going to result in anything, but still, I repeat once again, we're committed to a negotiation solution and to a ceasefire. That is what we're doing every day, declaring humanitarian corridors daily. And they're being ignored by Azovstal-based Azov Nazis using Nazi insignia of Nazi Waffen-SS battalions. That President Zelensky, responding to the CNN question, said that we have many such battalions, they are the way they are. And this phrase, they are the way they are, was cut out of the interview. It seemed a bit too much, too shameful to present that to the Western democratic community, a person with all of his subliminal thoughts. So we're prepared to hold negotiations. If anyone has very interesting ideas, we're prepared to listen to them. As for mediation, per se, at this stage, well, at the previous stage, the Ukrainian negotiators did not mention that. Our teams are meeting one-on-one. They've met 3 times in Belarus. They've met once in Turkey. These are platforms for negotiations, and we'd like to thank both hosts for organizing and for the warm welcome. However, talking about the mediators at this stage, I think it's a bit premature. We'd like to receive the response for our last draft of the document that we have transferred about 10 or 12 days ago, that the Ukrainian negotiators did not report to their president.